And everybody should have gotten that request, and we are good to go then. So we do have the captions on, and we do have an interpreter with us today. So welcome to Disability. It's Not What You Think. And so Dr. Tony and my name is Vanessa Spero. I'm with IFAS 4-H Youth Development, and I'll let Tony introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Independent Living of North Central Florida. And this presentation is part of the Florida AgrAbility program, which is supported by the United States Department of Agriculture, and of course, in collaborations between the University of Florida and our Center for Independent Living. And with this presentation, what we're aiming to do is discuss that within the disability community, understanding the different words, the laws, the culture of disability can be daunting to those that are, not having as much experience with disability. And so what Vanessa and I are seeking to do in this presentation / discussion that we're going to have is talk about our personal and professional experiences as it pertains to the world of disability, to give people a lens into it. And go over some of the different words that are used, the stereotypes and stigmas that can often surround disability, talk about some tips for communicating with people with disabilities, and even maybe just scratch the surface on some of the laws, particularly the Americans with Disabilities Act as it pertains to disability. And the title for this presentation came about from my discussions with Vanessa. And so Vanessa, if you didn't mind, maybe orient us, because I think this is a good leaping off point to talk about the origin story behind the title for our presentation today here, Disability, It's Not What You Think.
Absolutely. So for those of you who do know me, I definitely share a lot of my personal stories because they have led to my professional journey also. And so I have a 8-year-old son with Down syndrome, and he was diagnosed prenatally. And when I got the phone call, unfortunately, diagnosis stories are oftentimes not the most pleasant experiences. And so I had received the call while I was at work, and I was not surrounded by any family. It was kind of a bit shocking to hear kind of expectations of what information, what results you get from a test. And so I made some phone calls. I was unable to get in touch with my husband. And so I called my family. I called my father and my mother. And the very first thing that my father said to me, I said, your grandson has a diagnosis of Down syndrome. And he said to me, it's not what you think. And those were the words that I needed to hear, because I had an impression, I had an idea of what a person with Down syndrome was like. Not that I had any experience, but I had a preconceived notion. And when he said that, that was exactly what I needed to hear, to know that everything was okay, that I had the support systems, and that I could learn and thrive with my son. And so that's really where this came about. It's not what you think. And I will say too, my father now has patches going around. We're going to go ahead and use this term as much as we possibly can, because it definitely has a place in this conversation that we're having today. I'm going to go ahead and get some slides going here.
For me, the not what you think aspect of this, and so I was born with a disability. It's a low vision disability that has deteriorated over time. Legally blind, likely to go blind. And so I've been in the world of disability for a little while, and I continue to learn about what it means to have a disability, not just for myself, but encountering other people. And oftentimes, what I'm learning is it's not what I think either. For my experiences, from other people's experiences and how they encounter disabilities, and the different types of perspectives that people have. I am continuing to learn. For me, it's a lifelong process that has no finish line. And with that, entering into a conversation like this, like for many conversations that have to do with diversity and groups that people might not be associated with, I often find that it's really important to let people know that we're in a safe space to have conversations here. We do have the chat open if people want to make comments or questions throughout this. We want to attend to where people are coming from and wanting to learn. And you're in a safe space to learn. Please ask questions, make comments. This the best way is learning from each other's personal experiences. And that's what Vanessa and I are here to do. And we have a wide range of knowledge and attitudes and beliefs and experiences, and we want to be in a space where that's okay to share those kind of things, even when we don't agree. I think it's very important. That's, if we can let go of our own biases and see the world through another perspective of someone else, and to consider what it must be like from their experiences, and then to revisit our own perspectives and to reconcile the two, I believe is very important in how we can learn and foster a worldview that could be expansive and beyond what we might enter into this conversation with, and we're doing this with respect too. It's important that we respect different beliefs and thoughts and attitudes, and if there are issues or barriers or circumstances that we see those as opportunities to grow and to learn. So I want to share everybody that we're in a safe space to learn, and there's no such thing as a dumb question or to share a perspective that Vanessa and I might not have or hold or be articulating. Please know you're in a safe space that we all want to learn and grow. I am continually learning as I go along, and I seek to continue to learn, and I usually learn best when people share their perspectives and ask questions. So I just wanted to kind of center this discussion around that safe space.
Thanks, Tony. And of course, if you don't feel comfortable, then you can contact us. We'll have that information at the end of the slideshow, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation in your own space that's comfortable too. So we'll start with our definitions. We're going to go ahead with the ADA definition, and there are a lot of slides towards the end of this presentation that we are not going to get to. So we will share those with you. That's why we had you register. So you will receive that information of stuff that we really don't have time to go over today, because we're really kind of focusing on the conversation and the comfort level. So the definition: a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of an individual, being regarded as having such an impairment, and see a record of such an impairment. So Tony, do you want to share anything else about the definition?
Yeah. It's funny. Yeah, when I'm in trouble with my mother, I'm Anthony. So,
I know. You're pinned as Anthony.
But so for me, I have a vision disability. That's a physical impairment, and it limits a major activity of daily living, driving. I'm an adult who could drive if I had the visual acuity to do it. And so it's a very broad definition. It talks about physical and mental being two categories. Activities of daily living are something that's used in the medical and public health field, and they're very quantifiable. There's a list of what those activities of daily living are. They're instrumental activities of daily living. So this does get categorical in terms of how it's defined, and it's very quantifiable as well. But it's also in many respects very broad. And so, like the next slide shows like a little, more narrow, the physical, mental, but also, that could be intellectual. It could be sensory. So that gets into, breaks out into further categories beyond the two that are subgroups of those two categories. And on the next slide, is just a smidgen of different specific diagnoses that would fit under the physical, mental, or intellectual and sensory in there. I mean, there's literally thousands of different types of diagnoses that would fit under the ADA definition. I mean, this is just a smidgen of what those might be. Anything from autism, PTSD, muscular dystrophy, epilepsy, deaf or hard of hearing, blind. There's spinal cord injuries. So the definition is very broad when you think of physical, mental, but when you get into the very specifics that would be covered under the ADA, there's literally thousands of different types of diagnoses.
And then this is one of those things where you always learn something new. So I'm sitting here looking at this list again, and migraine headaches. So I suffer from migraine headaches, have my entire life. And it's kind of amazing to look at the history of the treatments that have come out over time for a lot of the disabilities that are on this list, as well as the fact that, you know, every disability has maybe almost a set of items that could be considered if you have this disability. So for Down syndrome, for example, you know, there's certain aspects that are very particular to that genetic disorder. And so you know, somebody who has Down syndrome may or may not have those certain characteristics or traits, but oftentimes a lot of them do. And so that becomes easier to kind of understand that diagnosis and the services that are necessary. And so that kind of changes over time, though, and advances depending on really where we are, where the agenda is being pushed with people with that disability. So just a snapshot, you know, just a couple of things. Yeah. And so if we're looking at the statistics, and this is just for Florida, so you can find your county, find where you're from, and you can look at this data, which shows you the percentages of people with disabilities. And so if you look at some of those counties are as high as up to 26%. And you can see that it doesn't matter urban versus rural, coastal versus inland. You're going to have just a variety.
And I think what's interesting about this, there's 67, you know, counties in Florida, and this is representing those, and the darker shades of blue are higher percentages of disability and lighter or lower. This is all ages. So, you know, when we look at, you know, groups like people who are adults, it turns to 1 in 4 people would have a disability on average. And when you look at this being all ages, there's you know, quite a few people. And so it's often noted that people with disabilities represent the largest minority population among all the different types of minority groups that can be broken out demographically. So, you know, 1 out of 4 adults, that's 25%. And as we get older, that percentage goes up. So over half of people over the age of 60 has a disability. And, you know, in terms of the worldwide, it would, if you took all the people in the world who had a disability, it'd be the 5th largest country, population-wise. So it's very common. If you do not have a disability, there's a very high likelihood that you know someone that has a disability, someone that perhaps you even care about or are close to, and you're going to be encountering people throughout your day-to-day lives that has disability, whether you can see it or not. And I always like to think of this as just it's a natural part of the human condition that impacts all of us, either directly or indirectly. That if a person lives the average lifespan, they too themselves will, if you don't have a disability now, will likely acquire one. So this is something that I find to be an area that is important to all of us, a community that I think we will all belong to if we don't yet belong to. And if we don't yet belong, that it's a community that I think it's important to understand, and something that hopefully can unite us, you know, and bring us closer together, since this is something that we have in common.
And thinking about the fact that this is the, you know, adult and youth population, and it is probably more likely that some of our youth are the ones that are getting diagnosed, especially if they're needing services for public school, that disability has to be diagnosed and it has to be recorded in order to get services. And so if we think about that percentage, and I'm sure this resource probably does have that broken out, adult versus youth, but I know that I've come across quite a few adults that are learning as adults that they are now being diagnosed with a disability that, my life might have been a little bit easier earlier on had I known this, had I been more aware of it, had I had some assistance and support. So it's definitely more prevalent than we can imagine. And so that statistics, again, 1 in 4, like that's huge.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing that up, Vanessa, because likely this percentage is underreported. And so underreported because people aren't aware that they potentially have a disability, or sometimes on survey research and doing these kind of things, people may not want to even admit on a survey that they might have a disability. So when I was working at the University of Florida, to your point, I was on a project that were supporting students who had learning disabilities, who I came to learn they preferred learning differently instead of LD, learning disability, learning differently. And one of the common traits is that many of these students didn't realize that they had LD until they got to college. And we would, have focus groups with them, and how it, in retrospect, helped them to better understand some of the challenges or barriers that they faced academically before they realized that they had that diagnosis. So it's not uncommon that people will not be diagnosed with especially a learning disability or other types of disabilities into young adulthood. So that is somewhat common.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to throw it out to our participants. And if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat box, and Noelle will help us with this, to what are some synonyms for disability that you have heard that, and you can do the good, the bad, and the ugly. Again, safe space if you feel comfortable to do that. When you think of disability, what do you think of? What are the words that come to your mind?
We've got challenged, handicapped, differently abled, slow, all abilities, impairment, varying abilities, special needs, disability, unique abilities, retarded, profoundly disabled,
so
hindered, handicapped.
Thank you for sharing. Like that, I really appreciate that. When I think of some of the terms that are used there, where do you hear handicap still being used? The place where I hear it's still being used quite a bit is in parking and
the DMV.
parking. Yeah. Do people
Yeah.
know the kind of more what now the consensus is the way to refer to those parking places? Accessible parking is typically like the words that are being more encouraged nowadays. And so when I hear special needs, Vanessa, I think you might be able to speak to this more. It's usually around the realm of education that special needs tends to be the word that's predominantly used, or exceptional student education. Impairment. I work, in the public health field, and occupational therapist or physical therapist will talk a lot about impairment reduction. I hear that used quite a bit in the field there. Challenge.
We had a couple folks in the chat also mentioned that they've seen that term handicapped in bathrooms as well.
Still used in bathrooms.
Yep.
That's a good point. Yeah, the handicap stalls. Yeah.
And I want to say thank you. I know that somebody did put retarded in the chat box, and I grew up as an 80s kid, and that was a common term that we used often, and it has an actual definition, which is slow. To slow down, and so unfortunately it did cross over to that negative connotation, and it has been difficult as an 80s child. And obviously once my son was born, that was a word I definitely wanted to strike from my vocabulary, but it was difficult at first because it was something that was a norm for a while. Whether it should have been or not, that's not the question. And so we're learning, we're all learning, we're all, are the awareness that we want to have is what's going to change us from maybe using some of the words that aren't such positive, don't have positive connotations. The other thing that's interesting too with Down syndrome is a term that used to be very common way back when, was mongoloid, because of the features. And so that's another term that was more towards, and that was, addressing culturally Mongolian population. And so it's interesting how words do change over time. And I think one of the big things is we'll go ahead and we'll throw that up there, is that there's no expectation for all of us to know the correct word at any time. My son, Down syndrome, trisomy 21, if you want to be technical, but I still go to doctors and they will say, oh, he has Downs instead of Down syndrome. And so, that's in the Down syndrome community, we don't usually say Downs, we say Down syndrome. And so that's something that, okay, but this is a doctor, this is his livelihood, he is helping my child. Am I going to get hung up on the term that he used at that moment? I'm not going to, because overall his heart is in the right place. And I know he's coming from a time period, or she's coming from a time period where maybe that was the acceptable term, and just haven't, been to a cultural class in 20 years to know that we've updated some of the terms that we use. So just, keep that in mind. We're all kind of adjusting and learning what the best terminology is, and it changes. It definitely changes on a regular basis sometimes.
Absolutely, and you really have to think about who's the one that's determining the right, the wrong, and those kind of things, and that's something we can get into the culturally, but often it does happen in post-secondary institutions, in academia. Drives a lot of this. It's certainly where the demedicalization of disability came from, where people first terminology started really coming from, and even other areas in terms of diversity. It does often, and yeah, you would need to be getting, your ear to the ground and getting your doctorate in these areas to be able to keep up with it. And so what I find is a lot of times that people, like Vanessa was mentioning, that are in the world of disability can often have a lot of grace for people who aren't keeping up with what the consensus is. And that's certainly something that, in this presentation, we want to, draw people's attention to. Is that it's hard to understand, and if people may be using outdated words, then it's a good opportunity to disorient and to say some of the things that need to be said. And from my perspective, and this is just me, words are important, and yes, words do matter. At the same time, the word itself is kind of like, for me, a signpost that's pointing towards the essence of what we're discussing. So if that doctor is saying, Downs, and perhaps the etiquette is Down syndrome, well, he's or she is trying to, get to the point of something that we need to perhaps discuss. We can get, have a long conversation about the word, but then, it's kind of delaying getting to the meat and potatoes of what the word is pointing towards. And for me, I often think about, the philosopher Alan Watts once said, we don't get wet from the word water, and so I often think sometimes when I have difficulties with words and how they're being used, I often try to, take the power out of them, as well, so they do matter. And so a second follow-up question that we have for people, because even the word disability can be a very hard word for some people to hear. And it's the word that has been institutionalized. The Americans with Disabilities Act, it's used in education, it's used in medicine, it's used in transportation and fair housing. When you look at a lot of the laws that are on the books, the disability is the word that right now is being most used. And given that, some people don't have a great association with that or the other synonyms, what would be a better word? Again, we're welcoming people into the chat to have this. So if things are evolving and words do matter, is there a better word that we could be using to describe what this word currently is pointing towards?
Well, everybody is thinking about that and putting it in the chat box, hopefully. Person first language, if you're not familiar with that term. So it is putting the person first and the disability second. So it's not a Down syndrome child, it's a child with Down syndrome. It's not an autistic child, it's a child with autism. So it's putting the person first and then that disability second. And that you can't go wrong with person first language. That's kind of a standard that you'll always be in a safe zone, I would say. I think we have one in there, Noelle, did we?
Yeah, just person with autism.
Yep. So that's your example of that person first language.
And like I was mentioning before, when we were working with the students who had learning disabilities, they preferred the word learning differently. And that was their choice, you know, to be more empowered with a different way of describing what disability is. I've heard neurodivergent. You know, I've heard spectrum of capabilities. You know, and given that, you know, maybe there's not a lot of input on the chat, puts towards the essence of this question, it's hard to come up with that word that could capture what we're talking about. That's also empowering. It's not easy. And if we do come up with that word, is it going to be a word that we get 100% consensus with? You know, I've heard handy capable, or like these other kind of things that for some just sounds like they're trying too hard to come up with a word to describe the essence of what we're talking about, to put these softeners on it.
Yeah.
You know, it's difficult. Words do matter, right? So is there a more empowering word? It's not easy to come up with what potentially that word might be.
All right. What we got, Noelle?
We have a couple additions. We have people with functional limitations, differently abled, neurodivergent. And then Paula just said she learned yesterday that the school systems are changing labels. Instead of profound, it's IND. Instead of being ESD, so IND meaning intellectually disabled.
And I mean, if you think about that, as Tony referenced before, exceptional student education, you know, and so you're saying exceptional, you know, that's a little more of a positive connotation than some of the other words that we've used in the past. Okay, where do we go to next? Where do we land? So here's just, this is, you know, some of that stigma. Again, we're kind of part of the solution, I would say. And so a lot of us are coming in with some history. I mean, I had a stigma when my child was diagnosed. Like I'll be the first to admit it. And you hear that a lot from diagnosis stories from families, that they had a perception or an idea of what the disability was that their child was going to have, based on what they knew from the past, the history, the stories. And our history it's pretty short. You know, for those of you that are aware, ADA was passed in 1990. That's not that long ago, 33 years ago. So it's a short story right now. It really is. And one of the things here you see, not every disability is visible. And so that's something that we really are faced with as educators and professionals and practitioners, that there are a lot of invisible disabilities. You don't always see what somebody is facing with and somebody is dealing with on a regular basis. And those are what we call the invisible disabilities, that unless somebody tells you or you recognize it, you're not going to know that there's something that they might need assistance with.
You know, and I often think about, you know, stigma and, you know, why is there a stigma related to disability? And, you know, I continue to examine that. And I think like one of the more, I think, tangible reasons is that exercise we just went through, you know, and, you know, if you open up a thesaurus and you look at all the synonyms for the word disabilities, they're not too flattering. And so, you know, the words we do use matter. And so that's part of it. And, you know, the stereotypes that a society might have about, you know, what it's like to have a disability likely goes into it. And, you know, those stereotypes can be driven by, you know, culture, you know, pop culture, so many different things that are out there that people consume, and could have all kinds of generalities that don't apply specifically to people. You know, for me, you know, when we look especially towards mental health and some of the stigmas that are associated with that, and people perhaps not disclosing that they may have some challenges regarding that, and what it really means. as somebody that is in the area of helping to serve people with disabilities, stigma is an important issue to address. When I was working at the VA, the Veterans Health Administration, and I was working to reach veterans that were coming back home from the recent conflicts with traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and/or any mix of those. One of the things that we found very challenging was that of those veterans that have those types of service-connected disabilities, only 15% of those veterans that had those disabilities were accessing care and getting any assistance for it. And so one of the things that I was very interested in was why is that happening? And the most common response I got from meeting with veterans was because of the stigma. They were not wanting their friends, their family, potentially their employers, or others to know that they have a disability. And so the stigma was precluding them from getting services that they could benefit from. So I find that stigma is a very important issue to address and assist people in overcoming, especially people that could utilize some resources and services. I think about this all the time in the position that I occupy in serving people, because I'm thinking about the people that aren't coming to us, and what can we do to help destigmatize disability, so that people that could utilize resources and services can overcome that kind of stigma. That really spoke to me, because I see veterans being very courageous and very brave. And so if it's impacting them, that shows me that stigma is a very real issue that definitely needs to be addressed.
And I think that that's really relevant to, again, where we are in our professional lives, as well as our personal life. But if we think about the fact that we are trying to be accessible for all to, be a part of our programs, and if there's a stigma that person is facing, that they already feel like they don't even want to share that they have a disability or recognize that they have one, but there's an expectation on us as professionals to make accommodations or to provide some type of a service, but that person isn't even comfortable with the fact that they have a disability. And so we always want to do our best. So I think being conscious of that and knowing that when we look at our programs, when we look at things that we offer, when we look at the world that we're living in, if we're just thinking in the mindset of, we don't always know what somebody else is going through. And so if we're just off the bat providing the services to the best of our ability, providing the accommodations for everybody, whether or not they have told us or not, we're doing our best. And so that's really the impression. We're not all going to know every right thing to do, but we know the wrong things to do. And so I think we can take that with us and just remember that in what we're doing in our professions.
When I think, and I've done a lot of work in this area to better understand stigma, and even for myself, like I still sometimes will struggle with disclosing disability when I go to a doctor's office or somewhere else where I'm needing to complete written forms that aren't accessible for me in my vision, and I now have to ask for assistance. And usually I'm having to ask somebody who's very busy to take time out of what they're doing to come assist me. I sometimes struggle with that myself, even as long as I've been living with this and realizing that, people are typically very accommodating and being able to do that. I often still find myself thinking like, oh my gosh, are they going to think poorly of me? Are they going to judge me? Are they going to think I'm illiterate? And so when I think of stigma, I do often think that, as part of the human condition, that we are social, beings, and our number one need is to be accepted by people. Our number one fear is to be rejected by people. And so I think the more that people can be, open and accepting, and I find that that's very common, more often the case than not, the better. Because it does take a level of vulnerability on the part of a person with a disability to talk about it or disclose it or to ask for help. And so I often challenge myself and others who do have disabilities that are experiencing that vulnerability or that fear to lean into it and with courage. courage can't exist unless there's a little bit of fear there. So I always find that stigma is incumbent upon all people. The person that has the disability to overcome stigma, fear is part of the perpetuating of the stigma, and so the acceptance of people who don't have the disability that may be in a position to help and be accepting it's also incumbent there, and how we can destigmatize disability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that this is definitely very common. And I will always obviously speak to the parent of a child with disability because that's the life that I live. So again, when I'm signing my son up for something, do I disclose? Do I not disclose? Should it matter? What will it affect? Because I don't want him to be denied opportunities and services, but I want him to have the best experience that he can have. So, am I going to put my foot forward and trust that this organization is going to do that? Or am I going to feel like, we've been discriminated against and they don't want my son to participate for whatever reasons? And so think about all of those times that anybody that's participated in something has been discriminated against when they have disclosed, which might be the reason why they aren't disclosing and sharing that they have a disability before they attend your program. So we have to look at it like an open book and consider all those scenarios and all of those things that somebody is facing. And that's where it just comes back to being open and having the conversations and inviting and creating that inclusivity and sense of belonging. And if you've, this comes later in the slides, but I'm just gonna, say it now. Again, we've said ADA, 33 years old. So if you have not looked at the video, Capitol Crawl, when they were looking to get ADA passed, and the fact that, 35 years ago, there weren't accessible walkways. There weren't, if you were in a wheelchair, you had to go in the street. You couldn't get onto the sidewalk. There was no little ramp for you to get onto the sidewalk so that you can be safe. You had to be in the street with cars. Okay. And that's not that long ago. And so think about just the history of that. I think we kind of get to that probably. Should we jump around, Tony? Should I just keep going forward?
Sure. Yeah, I don't mind jumping around. Yeah.
We like to jump around.
PowerPoints are so linear. It's hard to have a circular conversation.
Which is why you'll get this after. So if you look at this, here's by the numbers. Okay, so here are some things that have happened, over time. And, civil rights was really the precursor to the disability movement. It followed up after that. And in 1972, the Center for Independent Living. So think about, what is Tony's organization? The Center for Independent Living. Okay. And what does independent living mean? It means that giving people with disabilities an opportunity to live independently. Okay. So not to be in an institution, to maybe grow up at home and have the same childhood any other child would have, but just the only difference is this child has a disability, but they get to grow up the same as their other siblings. The Rehabilitation Act addressing the needs that can be met for people in workforce or in other areas. And Tony, you can probably speak more to the direct implications for the Rehabilitation Act, because I'm obviously having like a mind blunder right now. Education for All Handicapped Act, that was the beginning of what is more familiar to us as the IDEA. So individual, I can't think of acronyms right now, Tony, you got to.
Disability Education Act.
Thank you. Yeah. The acronyms are not working with me today.
It's alphabet soup. Yeah.
It is. It really, really is. But just look at the dates on these, and that's really enough to tell you where we are in the journey, where those with disabilities are in the journey, and then it kind of brings us to some more movements. So I'll let Tony take this slide.
Yeah, social movements don't occur in a vacuum. They often overlap and commingle and these kind of things. And the independent living movement was credited in the early 60s by a fellow named Ed Roberts, who had polio and was able to get into the University of California at Berkeley. And yet, back then in the 60s, they certainly didn't have a disability resource center or the other kind of accommodations that are required by law today. And so he had to do a lot of advocacy for that. And a lot of the strategies and talking points that they adopted came from the civil rights movement era, which was happening during the same time in the 60s. And it did lead to the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, which, among many of the different kind of things that, was in that act, was to deinstitutionalize disability. Up until this time, and this still occurs today in many areas, people with disabilities were just warehoused in institutional care facilities. And if you look into the history of this and pretty deplorable conditions, forced sterilization, particularly of people who had intellectual disabilities. And so the purpose of that was to get people out of these institutions and into the community, to live independently and provide the resources or services that are necessary for people to live in the community. And whether that's, personal care attendance, home modifications, the ability to work, to go to school, to have social supports, transportation, was a very big part of that. And as Vanessa was sharing with the Capitol crawl, there were a lot of civil rights strategies that were used in New York City. They stopped the bus system because buses weren't accessible. And people with disabilities who utilize wheelchairs, really showed up in numbers, and it stopped the bus systems. They showed up to take them to jail, but they didn't have accessible, vehicles to put everybody into, to take them away. It literally stopped traffic in, Times Square. In San Francisco, they had a lock in.
Sorry, your sound is a little weird.
Okay.
I don't know why. Figured I would just correct that.
All right. How am I now?
Perfect.
All right. And so there was a lot of things that were going on during that time in that era, which led to, the demedicalization of disability, which really started occurring in the late 90s and is, still today, especially in the areas of public health, where instead of just focusing on the individual and trying to fix the individual, it looks at the social and environmental context in which disability occurs. And looking at that and how we can adapt and modify social and environmental conditions to address disability.
And I think it's important when you look at that, disabilities, opposes traditional thought on disabilities or impairments to be cured. And I think that that was the old science, was let's fix you. Let's, turn you into neurotypical. Let's, make you like everybody else. And so that your disability isn't, as prevalent or noticeable or affecting you as much. And obviously that's not the thought anymore. Because, at what point was, why was there that negative connotation with disability? Why was it something that had to be cured? Why couldn't it be that this person has value in society for who they are? Not what they have per se. So, I think thinking of it in that way, I look at my son oftentimes and, sometimes it's hard to characterize what is a feature of his disability versus what is a feature of his personality. And, so who knows, you could never draw that line of, what is what, nor could you do that with anybody, with a disability or not. And so that kind of brings me to, though, I look at my son and to know that, 40 years ago, people thought he had no value. His life had no value in this world. And knowing the value that he brings to our family and to society for people that he meets, that is very sad. That makes me very sad to think that had this been a different time, he would have been treated a lot differently. And he wouldn't have been living at home growing up with us. That wouldn't have been necessarily the norm unless I was somebody who was fighting to change that. And that was in the 70s that started. So I face that a lot on a regular basis. And it is sad. It is sad to think that 40 years ago, my son had no value in this world.
So the movement still continues, and again, this is under the context of understanding the community of people with disabilities, that it's a movement, it's a culture and it's services. And within the culture, there's terms that are quite frequently utilized, and this is a list of them, where there's diversity, inclusion, equity, independent living, ableism, access and accessibility, universal design, and effective communication. So these are terms that are quite often used. We got some slides up ahead that'll unpack some of them. Diversity, I find that sometimes defining these terms with words can be difficult, and that graphs can do a better job at it. So recognizing that we are all individual pieces that are unique, and at the same time, when we're included, we're all one. That we have more in common than we do differently. This is a graphic that was shown to describe inclusion within emergency management. So within emergency management, this has some legal implications, this definition. So when a disaster occurs, a natural disaster, we're in Florida, we get hurricanes. It's the law that people with disabilities be included in general population shelters if they don't have a major medical condition, like needing to be on oxygen, having a personal care attendant that might need to take care of some self-care. Special needs shelters really are only for people that almost need to go to the hospital, that they have a medical condition that's pretty significant. For myself, I have a disability. And I'm in decent health. I'm to go to a general population shelter, as is someone who is deaf and doesn't have a major medical condition, or someone that has autism and doesn't have a major medical condition. This is not widely known, and so we do a lot of education for telling people in emergency management, when you refer somebody to a general population shelter, and we use this a lot, and we say exclusion would be keeping them out of the shelter altogether, general population shelter. Separation would be, having a general population shelter with adjacent buildings. One building's people with special needs, and the other one's the general pop. Integration, which would be like within a shelter, people with disabilities are in one room, and people without disabilities are in another. Now that can happen when there's shelters that accommodate people who have sensory challenges. People with autism perhaps might need a safe space to go into, and integration is the appropriate thing to do there. But inclusion would be, everybody's within the same space, everybody's within the same shelter, and this could be schools. This could be a lot of different settings that we see the different levels of, between exclusion to separation to integration and to inclusion. But inclusion would be, the model that, at least today, that we're most shooting for, but it isn't always the right one, but it is the one that's the most ideal.
You opened up my question I was going to ask you. Is inclusion always the way to go? Is that always the best for the situation?
Yeah, and I would say no. It definitely depends on the context of the person who has the disability, the resources and supports that are available or not available at that time. I think it's the ideal, but at times it's not always the most appropriate.
Exactly. And we have to think about all of the history, the experiences that people have had. And so sometimes inclusion isn't appropriate. It isn't the best environment. And again, I'll throw it back to my experience, which is with my son, where before I had a child with disability, inclusion made the most sense to me. If a child has a disability, he should be in a classroom with his peers and, have assistance, obviously, but pulling him out all the time, that's detrimental. That can't be good for the child. Lo and behold, I have a child with a disability, and inclusion is not always the perfect setting. Sometimes I prefer activities that are fully with the disability community, and sometimes I feel like we can have that expectation, that accommodation, and do well in an activity that is fully inclusive. And so you kind of pick and choose. And so I think that we also have to recognize that inclusion isn't always the way to go. It depends on if we're teaching a class, what are we teaching about? What is the material that we're presenting? Is it appropriate that you could be just one class and it's inclusive, and you create the steps and it works out okay, or maybe it needs to be a disability specific program targeted towards, and not even just all people with disabilities, but perhaps we're looking at physical disabilities versus intellectual and cognitive disabilities and what's appropriate for those two different types of disabilities. And so I think we have to remember that inclusion isn't always the answer. And like Tony said, it's the ideal, but it's not always the best. It's not always the most appropriate, depending on other factors. So definitely keep that in mind.
Well said.
And I think this has been seen a lot. And so hopefully you have seen this already, that we really understand the difference between equality and equity. So, you know, all things being equal, you give everybody the same, you know, so that first picture, you gave everybody the same size rock so they could see over the wall. But when we're looking at things equitably, then you give what that person needs to be on par. You know, that they can see over the wall, you need 3 instead of 1 rock. So it's giving what is need. But then right here, you've got that extra addition of when you remove a barrier, a systemic barrier, and then what can be achieved at that point. So any thoughts to add to that, Tony?
No, again, like I've been in places where I've had to articulate the differences between equality, equity. And again, I think the graphics do so much better of a job than when I'm able to explain it. And the last one there where the barriers just removed altogether. And this barrier could be housing, it could be transportation, it could be employment, it could be access to school. That fence could represent so many different things. And with universal design, you know, that was one of the terms that we used there. And this is something that at the University of Florida, I know is very encouraging in the educational system, is that to remove the barriers altogether for anyone is again another ideal to shoot for. So ideally, if this was school, post-secondary education, if a person had a disability, they wouldn't have the need to present the professor with an accommodation request. That the accommodations would be there for everyone, so that everybody universally could access the educational content, the materials, whatever it may be, that any barriers already removed for any kind of situation that someone may encounter. And then that's the ideal, you know, again, place to be. It goes beyond, you know, equality, equity, and it's what some have called just. You know, this is the just way, you know, to do it. So again, that's what we're hopefully aiming towards, and we progress as a society and culture and getting towards where we have universal designed access.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with universal design, then definitely look it up. There's some resources at the end of the slideshow, which I know we're getting short on time, and we do want to leave the opportunity for questions. We knew we weren't going to get through everything because we really just kind of wanted to open this up as that discussion and get more comfortable with the idea and the words surrounding disability. But universal design is something we really should all be incorporating in everything that we do. And so it's really breaking down the notion that if you've ever heard, what kind of a learner are you? Are you a visual learner? Are you a kinesthetic learner? Are you an auditory learner? Guess what? We're all different learners depending on the type of material that we are learning. So every time we are educating, every time we are having the conversations with people, we need to be doing everything. We need to be presenting that material, sharing that information in various different formats to meet everybody's needs, no matter if there is a disability or not. And universal design was initially created for the disability community. That's how it started, but now its implications are for everybody because it's helpful for everybody. So, you know, just remember that too, is that we can all, you know, use that to our advantage. And we've got so many great resources for those of us. I know we've got a lot of University of Florida faculty on this call right now. You know, UF has really been doing some great new branding materials, new ADA accessible. And so all of that stuff ties into that also to make it more user-friendly for not just people with disabilities, but everybody.
Well said.
So maybe we'll maybe go through a few of the independent living culture slides, and then we'll just kind of wrap up a little bit and hang out for question and answer, and we'll send you this PowerPoint for sure.
Well, so independent living, again, is the idea that people with disabilities represent a culture that has certain tenets to it, certain beliefs, some certain philosophical foundations. And this is what some of those tenets are, is that people with disabilities have a shared history and a shared struggle. We just scraped on some of that history today about, people with disabilities before weren't living independently. Many of them, they were institutionalized against their, own freedoms. It continues today to be a challenge, but, especially leading up to today, having access to education, work, transportation, housing, it continues to be a challenge. The movement is still alive and trying to really help facilitate. And through that, shared history and through that shared struggle is a bond, that many people with disabilities have with one another. I can connect with Vanessa, even though I don't have children, going through that I'm raising that have a disability. I, as a child with a disability myself, being raised, or just having that special, kind of like understanding of it's not easy and there's challenges with it, is very important in terms of having that sense of community. This understanding that every human being should have, some basic civil rights, and that people with disabilities are among all the other groups, whether it's race or male, female, or gender, or whatever it may be. Like we are asking for the same civil rights that people are inherently should have. That people with disabilities have valuable experiences and perspectives that can really help and benefit a community. That like Vanessa was saying, earlier, this idea that we don't have something of value to contribute is ridiculous. It's a real stress that people can have, but there's so much that can be contributed. I always find it very interesting when I go over, famous people who have disabilities, and a lot of times people have no idea about it, like people that have revolutionized science, leaders of countries. That have just done remarkable things. Whether it's big time like that or just in everyday living, we have a lot to contribute.
And I think that last bullet there, valuable perspective and experiences to contribute with the community. I think that's where it's also really important, where we think about what we're doing professionally and personally, and are we including the disability community? Are we inviting them to the table to participate? Are they sitting on committees that we're part of? Are they part of the planning process for things that we're implementing? Are they part of the conversation? And oftentimes that really is the area that is overlooked. We might check the box for race, ethnicity, gender, even urban versus rural, so where you live, but are we doing also disability also at the same time? So and I think a lot of these kind of echo a lot of what we've been talking about. Should not see themselves as problems to be solved. We talked about that very much so in a couple of slides ago with one of the timelines.
The medical model. That's how the medical model is. Let's fix them. Let's cure them.
Mm-hmm.
Versus like the social environmental. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is really, really important, are the best experts on their needs. So we cannot possibly learn everything about every disability. We saw the list in the beginning. It's just not possible. But asking people, if they have disclosed, asking, what is it that I can do for you? What can I provide? How can I help? How can I accommodate you? Like just asking those questions and not being afraid. You don't need to be afraid to ask those questions. And so sometimes people don't tell you, but maybe you notice that they could use some help, but they haven't told you. So maybe you're thinking, well, I'm not responsible, then I don't have to do that. But at the same time, you can still ask simply enough. And I know I've had this situation in some of our 4-H programs where somebody doesn't tell you. And so you're kind of like, I think that maybe this person has a disability they haven't shared with me, or maybe they aren't diagnosed, or maybe it's just characteristics that look similar to another type of disability. It's not my I don't need to know for a fact, but what I can do is I can go up to, if that's a child, go up to the parent, or even the child if they're old enough, and say, is there anything I can do to help you? Is there anything that would make this easier for you? Is there something I can do or provide to make this a more positive experience? And those are, that's a way to engage, to bring that person back into the fold, to create the inclusion and the sense of belonging that we want. And oftentimes people will be able to tell you, well, the lights are really bright in here, I'm having a hard time, or it's really loud, or I can't see the material that you're presenting very well. Simple things that we can just do to make that a better environment.
Yeah, and working at a Center for Independent Living, there's 15 statewide, there's 15 centers there's 400 centers throughout the nation. One of the requirements is that over half of the staff that work at these centers and over half of the board of directors, it has to have a disability. And it's been wonderful to be a part of an organization that is delivering services by people with disabilities, for people with disabilities, and that helps to really inform what is the best approach of WAVE, because we have the lived experiences, but also asking those we serve, how can we be doing better? What are we not doing that we should be doing? I think the model, especially the medical model before, was like, this other person's the expert and they're going to tell you what to do. Versus, let's learn a little bit about the people we're seeking to serve or support or to connect with, and learn from them. What is the best way of going about and doing those kind of things. And another facet of community is that we're stronger together and being united. And I go back to what Vanessa and I were talking about earlier, is that disability is very common. It touches all of us. And, given that we arguably live in a very divided time over many other areas within our society and within, the state of humanity, what an awesome opportunity to be united, to come together in terms of disability, to connect, to relate, to learn about one another, to learn about ourselves. This cuts across all ages, cuts across all other demographics, whether it's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, male, female, birth order, political affiliation, religious and or not religious affiliations. Disability cuts across all demographic areas. And what a wonderful space to be able to come together and to be more united. And as a community, when we recognize that, it gives very much a sense of connection, belonging, and unity that I believe many people are seeking and needing.
I think that is the perfect closing because we are over time. So I think that is honestly perfect to end right there. I'm going to shoot to the slide that is so you can see how many slides you can absolutely read over when we're done. But what I wanted to do was there's a whole bunch of resources that we've included that we'll send out also. And then here is our contact information. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a minute and we'll kind of close out. And I want to thank everybody for being with us. And we hope you enjoyed our conversation. Tony and I could talk for hours and hours and hours. But we'll hang on if anybody wants to ask us anything, and we could probably stop recording, I think, because maybe that'll provide, again, that safe space if somebody wants to ask something that they don't want recorded. So I'm going to stop recording. Thank you, everyone.